Today, we're going to completely shatter one of the most fundamental assumptions we have about biology and really the entire natural world. Since we were kids, we've all been taught this really simple equation: brain equals intelligence. We assume that if you want to learn, if you want to remember something, or make a complex decision, you absolutely need a central nervous system. But what if I told you the natural world has been hiding this mind-bending secret? What if true, measurable intelligence actually doesn't require a brain at all? It kind of sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Can you really have a memory without a brain? For the longest time, the scientific consensus was just a flat-out, resounding no. Cognition was thought to be this exclusive thing, heavily guarded by a fortress of billions of neurons locked right inside our heads. Okay, let's dive into this, because we are going to look at some groundbreaking data that literally proves memory, learning, and decision-making are happening all around us, in organisms that don't possess a single brain cell.
Section 1. The Brainless Genius.
Allow me to introduce our unlikely protagonist. It isn't a primate, it isn't a dolphin, and it certainly isn't some high-tech supercomputer. Actually, scratch that. It is, quite literally, a bright yellow puddle of goo. Meet Physarum polycephalum. This little guy is a single-celled slime mold. It grows into this vibrant, bright yellow, veiny structure called a plasmodium. Get this, it can reach up to 2 square meters in size, and it creeps along the forest floor at a blistering speed of about 5 centimeters per hour, basically propelled by the oscillatory contractions of its internal tubules. Now, looking at it, it appears incredibly simple, mindless even. It has no brain, it has zero nervous system, absolutely no neurons. Yet as you're about to see, it remembers, it learns, and quite frankly, this literal puddle of goo is about to outsmart some of our most basic assumptions about intelligence. Section 2. The escalation of experiments. What started out as a quirky biological curiosity quickly escalated into undeniable proof of complex cognition. Let's walk through this timeline together, because it's fascinating. The whole thing really kicked off in the year 2000. Researcher Toshiyuki Nakagaki published a landmark paper in the journal Nature, showing that this brainless slime mold could literally find the shortest path through a maze by optimizing its tube network. Just incredible. That sparked a massive resurgence in slime mold research. Jump to 2012, and researcher Chris Reed discovered extracellular slime memory. A year later, Reed proved that this memory could actually be overwritten. And then by 2016, we're seeing evidence of habituation and even memory transfer through cellular fusion. Each one of these experiments just systematically stripped away our assumptions about what non-neural organisms can do.
Section 3. Memory without a brain.
So, how exactly does a puddle of yellow goo pull off these cognitive feats? Well, this brings us to Chris Reed's brilliant 2012 experiment, which breaks down the mechanics of what we call extracellular memory. As the slime mold forages an area for food, it leaves behind an extracellular slime trail, kind of like a snail. But here is the absolute genius part. The slime mold effectively uses its own trail as a spatial map of depleted territory. When it senses its own slime, it knows it's already searched that spot, so it actively avoids it to save precious energy. Think about that. It isn't storing the memory inside a brain. The memory trace is being stored completely outside its body. And the data backing this up is just staggering. 10 times. To put that into perspective, researchers placed the plasmodia on an agar surface that was pre-coated with this extracellular slime. They were essentially tricking the organism by simulating an area it had already heavily foraged. The result? The slime mold took 10 times longer to reach a food source. This actively proves they recognize the slime, they remember that the territory is barren, and they deliberately avoid exploring it again. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how beautifully it demonstrates complex cost-benefit analysis. Back in 2013, Reed set up a Y maze. At the end of one path was basic oatmeal, which is the slime mold's usual go-to food. But at the end of the other path was a much higher quality food, yolk. Here's the catch. To get to the yolk, the slime mold had to cross its own slime trail, which, as we just learned, it's biologically programmed to avoid. But it did it anyway. It weighed the options, figured the high-quality yolk was worth the energy penalty, and crossed the barrier. This proves its memory trace is overwritable when new, highly salient information comes into play. That is integrated valuation, happening entirely without a nervous system.
Section 4. Stealing memories through fusion.
Okay, so we've established it can store memory in its environment and override that memory based on food quality. But let me set up the most staggering revelation yet: the ability to acquire a memory without ever having the personal experience. It's wild. Here's a stark contrast between two completely different forms of memory without learning.
On the left, we've got the external memory we just talked about, where slime trails serve as a physical map. But on the right, we have internal memory. In 2016, researchers Boso, Vogel, and Dusator conducted a mind-blowing experiment. They took a naive slime mold cell, one that had never been exposed to salt, and briefly fused it with a cell that had been heavily habituated to salt. After they separated them, that naive cell suddenly showed the exact same habituated tolerance to salt. It had instantly learned to tolerate a harsh environment by essentially downloading the memory from the other cell through direct fusion. No brain, no direct experience, yet the memory was completely acquired.
Section 5. Fungi and spatial decision-making. Now, this kind of brainless intelligence isn't just limited to slime molds. Enter Phanerochaete velutina, a type of wood decay fungus. Yu Fukasawa and his team at Tohoku University in Japan set up this incredible test of fungal decision-making. They arranged 9 wood blocks on top of soil in 2 different patterns, a cross and a circle. Then they let the fungus grow right from the center. Now, in the cross arrangement, something amazing happened. The fungus eventually abandoned the middle blocks and concentrated its growth outward to the edges, actively searching further for resources. It clearly distinguished between inward and outward growth. This demonstrates acute spatial direction recognition, again, from an organism without a central nervous system. Researcher Yu Fukasawa sums up this profound sense of awe perfectly. He said, "You'd be surprised at just how much fungi are capable of. They have memories, they learn, and they can make decisions. Quite frankly, the differences in how they solve problems compared to humans is mind-blowing." You know, when the actual scientists conducting the experiments are calling the results mind-blowing, you know for sure we're dealing with something paradigm-shifting.
Section 6, the Great Intelligence Debate. So it's time to pivot to the massive philosophical paradigm shift these findings trigger. To really grasp this, we have to look at a heavy philosophical concept called the extended cognition hypothesis. This was first proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers back in 1998. It's basically the idea that cognitive processes can actually loop out into the environment, rather than existing purely internally in a brain. Think of it like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs in a dark forest so you can find your way back. But the absolutely crucial distinction here is that for the slime mold, those physical breadcrumbs don't just trigger a memory in a brain, they literally are the memory. And this brilliantly illustrates the conclusion drawn by philosopher Matthew Sims in his 2025 essay on this exact topic. As he puts it, memory can extend beyond the confines of the body to involve coupled interaction with structures in the environment. Slime trails completely upend our traditional, rigid view that memory has to be strictly internal and entirely dependent on neurological experience.
But of course, not everyone agrees on what to call this whole phenomenon. Skeptics usually outline 3 levels in the intelligence debate. First, there's machine cognition, which is your basic data storage and programmed pattern recognition. Next up is animal intelligence, bringing in self-aware learning and relationship-based behavior. Finally, there's human metacognition, thinking about thinking and asking why. A lot of skeptics place fungi and slime molds firmly at that bottom machine cognition level. But when an organism can conduct cost-benefit analysis and instantly download a physical tolerance from a neighbor, doesn't that completely blur the line of what intelligence actually is? Section 7. Why brainless intelligence matters. Connecting all these biological quirks back to our world? So the crucial point is this. The natural world is layered with intelligence that we are only just beginning to understand. Recognizing this distributed intelligence has incredible real-world implications. First, it forces us to consider that consciousness itself might be distributed across environments, not just localized in a brain. Second, it gives us the blueprint for bio-inspired computing. In fact, slime molds are already being actively used by researchers as unconventional computers to solve really complex spatial algorithms. And finally, it demands that we completely rethink our definitions of intelligence across the board, from the simplest natural organisms right up to the development of artificial intelligence. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. We've seen undeniable proof of memory, of learning, of calculated risk-taking, all executed by organisms completely devoid of a central nervous system. So I'll leave you with this. If memory and complex decision-making fundamentally do not require a brain, where does consciousness actually begin? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.